All right. Hi, my name is Graham Johnstone. I'm a second-year debater at Vestavia Hills High School. And this presentation is Theory, Tricks, and Topicality. Oh, come on a second. Okay, there we go. First, what is theory? Theory is basically about what debate should be, or the rules of debate. Theory is used to check opponents' abuse and set better rules for debate, because debaters can indeed debate the rules of debate. What this means, if you're kind of confused, is that there are only like a couple of rules of debate. First is the resolution, obviously, and second is speech times. Everything else is up for debate. Everything else. Second, theory is a gateway to substance, meaning that theory is a voting issue that comes prior to substantive positions, because often what people say to justify theory before substantive positions is that, like, theory comes before substance because it's a prior question to engagement. Like, it's either a question of whether this practice is fair or this practice is educational, and these lead to impacts which we call pre-fiat, which are basically like these happen in the real world because of the debate round, not like in the fake debate round and the evidence we read. And how can we vote on a position if that position is unfair or educational? Again, prior question to engagement. Parts of a theory shell, I'll show one later, but part one is the interpretation, which is essentially saying that, like, it's basically the rule you say. So an example of this is interpretation. The negative may not run a conditional counterplan or something like that. That's not a good interpretation, but oh well. Violation, it's usually just like they do this or they don't. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Standards are kind of like, think of them kind of like as contentions, essentially. Well, that's a weird way to phrase it, but like, standards are essentially just like things the theory shall, things that are unfair, or things that, like, the unfair practice leads to, or things that, like, a more fair practice would lead to. And the voters are usually fairness and education, or nearly always fairness and education. I've actually never seen a round in which they weren't fairness or education. Those are widely accepted. And it's usually what the standards lead to. The interpretation did not add that, but it essentially spells out the rule that your opponent violates or fails to adhere to. Should be phrased positively, like the affirmative. An interpretation could be the affirmative may defend topical advocacy if they're doing something that's not topical. I.e., debaters should not run plans is wrong. Instead, say debaters should defend a resolution as a general principle as opposed to specifying a specific instance. That's correct. Another instance is debaters should not run nibs, which is wrong. Debaters should link all offense to one necessary and sufficient burden is correct. The violation. The violation demonstrates that your opponent has violated your interpretation. Be pretty specific and very specific and state exactly what they have done to be abusive. An example would be, my opponent read a plan that specifically advocated for the European Union to promote democracy instead of defending the United States as stated in the resolution. It's pretty long, but oh well. Standards, why it's bad. Fairness. Fairness, this is just like one of the voters, but standards under fairness are like ground, which is just like the amount or quality of arguments you have access to. Reciprocity, which is some practice is not equal. Something is making me do a lot more to get the ballot than my opponent. Strat skew, some rule is necessary to prevent something from really messing up my strategy. Time skew, some practice is hurting / wasting my time. Predictability, how predictable an arg is. Cherry picking, something that allows my opponent to choose whatever amount or type of ground they want. Other examples of standards under education include real world policy making, or something hindering our ability to get real world / policy knowledge. Philosophy, something hindering our ability to get education in the round. Clash, which is the debater prevents the af and neg for debating about the same issue, which prevents clash. Depth and breadth are also standards. Depth is how deep we go in an argument, and breadth is like how many arguments we cover. And standards, again, must link to voters. Voters, which is just a broader reason why standards matter. Again, a link to standards. It's basically like, why do we care about fairness or education as voters? Like, an example for why we care about education is just like, education is the only portable skill we gain outside of the round. It won't matter if we're fair or not in one round 20 years later, but the education we gain out of the round will. Reasons for why fairness matters are like, fairness is a prerequisite to any engagement in the round. If I'm not allowed to get equal access to the ballot, then like that's bad. And there's also like, debate is a game. Like, games have to be fair. That's just a structural understanding of what games are. And just another argument is, you can't get education out of debate unless the debate is fair, because then it hinders your ability to get education. Also contains some other important aspects. Voters contain other important aspects to determine what the theory means and how it should be debated. These are like paradigm issues. Or implications, yeah. How should the abuse be punished? Which is like, drop the argument or drop the debater. What would be enough to deter future abuse? That's just kind of like what the point of the implications are. And guidelines for theory. How should theory be debated in this round? Reverting issues or RVIs. Should the opponent be able to punish you if they win your theory shell? Which means that like, if their argument on your theory shell is better, should they win? Competing interpretations versus reasonability, which reasonability includes a bright line. Competing interests are, the opponent must respond with their own interpretation or shell, and if they don't, you can win off this thing called a risk of offense. So like, if there's a risk that you're more fair or more educational than your opponent, then you win off of competing interps. And the winner is whoever debates their shell better under competing interps. Under reasonability, some people don't like this because like the judge gets to debate. The judge gets to decide whether the argument was actually abusive. Normally, this thing called a bright line is provided, which tells a judge at what point the argument is abusive / not abusive. Examples are like structural abuse or in-round inclusion. If it hinders either of those, then it's obviously abusive. Responding to theory. Defense. You should say, I meet or I am not violating. A lot of these can be like semantic or like grammatical, which is like what semantic means. You could also attack drop the debater. Instead of drop the debater, make it drop the argument. Also, you could say that although these aren't really popular, you could say like fairness or education isn't a voter. Yeah. You could also attack no RVIs by saying stuff like, you could say stuff like, I spend so much time on theory and the debate has been so vested in theory that it'd be unfair not to give me an RVI. Or you can say something like, RVIs help like check bad shells that are just long. If my opponent, it's like holding people to a higher standard. If I'm not allowed to hold my opponent to a different standard through the RVI, then it justifies bad practices of bad theory shells. Offense you can garner off of a theory shell by the counter interp, stating a rule that counters their interpretation or a rule that you don't violate. For example, interp debaters should not run nibs, which that's a bad interp. We went over that earlier. Counter interp to that would be, debaters may run one nib plus a shell. Examples. I'll go on to examples later because like I have to get through the rest of the slides. All right. Topicality. Topicality, just rules. Oftentimes, each resolution is considered a quote-unquote rule in debate. Unlike speech times or prep times, the resolution can be interpreted in different ways. This oftentimes leads to a definitions debate, but it can also lead to topicality. Topicality versus definitions debate. Different format and arguments. Definition debates normally revolve around the credibility of source, etc. Topicality involves more arguments about like education and fairness, and the stakes for topicality are often much higher. Not even often, I'd say always. Yeah, they're just always much higher. Definitional topicality. The interpretation becomes a definition of the word in the resolution. The violation would be using some different definition. Some standards are like, topic education or resolutions provide specific issues to learn about. Ground clash, strat skew, real world education, etc. Voters would be fairness and/or education. Jurisdiction, which essentially means the judge is only allowed to vote about the resolution, but that's jurisdiction is actually a standard. Don't know why that's there. RVI, just some implications. RVI, drop the debater / argument, counter interpretation versus reasonability, stuff like that. Other types of topicality. Extra topicality. Aft does the resolution and something else that is unrelated. The planks / actions of the resolution, normally just one policy action, and extra topicality is really abusive. An example of this would be like on the former topic, not last year's, the September-October topic, which was voting ought to be compulsory, or in a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory. One example of extra topicality that the affirmative may argue is the plan text states in a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory with the addition of the establishment of voter holidays. Obviously, the establishment of voter holidays is a separate plan, but separate implementation, separate debate, really abusive, and affects topical. AF does something and the resolution happens because of that action. Kind of abusive, really confusing. Never really like. It's I haven't seen it. Most people have not seen it, and you probably won't have it, and you probably won't see it. Paragraph theory / spikes, often known as spikes. Normally, theory is initiated after the abuse happens. Obviously, as we had previously pointed out. But spikes anticipate abuse / set rules before anything happens in the 1AC or even 1NC. Essentially, what this means is that instead of saying that your opponent does something abusive, you're going to preempt arguments that could be seen as abusive, or preempt practices that could be seen as abusive. These are written as a paragraph, really sloppy, but can be advantageous. Most judges don't like them too much on the local circuit, but on the national circuit, judges usually like them. They're fine. And examples would be no RVI, AF gets a 1AR theory, drop the debater, fairness, weigh AF abuse against empirical bias. And this is written in an underview after the constructive case. I think, okay, presumption. Yeah. I don't think that I need to go on to this because this is just separate stuff. But examples. First, I'm going to go over an example of a theory shell, and then an example of a counter interp. So, this is a T shell. On this topic, it point out the word compulsory. The opponent does something that's not topical because they misconstrued the definition of the word compulsory. So the interpretation, back this up with the card, is that AS must defend compulsory voting as a mandated decision between two or more candidate or options. To clarify, they don't get to defend a blank ballot option, which is essentially there was this argument that none of the above ballots could just be filled out and the same result would occur. And onto the violation, there's a card. They conflate compulsory voting with compulsory balloting. That's when none of the above is an option, and that balloting and voting are two different decisions. Net benefits or standards, stable ground. They get to defend compelling votes when it benefits them, like saying Trump gets voted out, but they can exclude disads to forced voting by saying none of the above solves it. This kills education, again, links to voters, because since I can't generate answers, I don't know what I'm debating. Limits. They doubled the prep negs have to do, since we have to debate any instance of compulsory voting or compulsory balloting in a democracy. That's infinite. It kills education, since they can always exclude neg prep by saying it doesn't specifically respond to their AF. And on to voters. Voter education is a voter. That means our ability to learn about the topic from the round is impeded. That's why the reason the NSDA has a topic committee and changes topics every 2 months comes first, because it's constitutive of LD. And implication, drop the debater. They definitionally failed their burden by not affirming the topic. Dropping them makes them less likely to keep doing it. Implications of it: no RVIs. RVIs created chilling effects that encourage debaters to read non-TFs and win on RVI. This kills T's goal of checking abuse. T is just like topicality. Being T is an expectation. They shouldn't win because they followed the rule, as long as I shouldn't win. just as I shouldn't win because I don't go overtime. Here's another one that's probably better. These are just paradigm issues. So again, these are just like implications in voters. T is drop the debater. Their abusive advocacy skewed the debate from the start. Comes for when AR theory. A, if we had to be abusive, it's because it was impossible to engage in their AF. T outweighs on scope because their abuse affected every speech that came after the 1AC. Topic norms outweigh on urgency. We only have a few months to set them. And 3, use competing interpretations on T. A, topicality is yes, no question. You can't be reasonably topical. B, reasonability invites arbitrary judge intervention and a race to the bottom of questionable argumentation. No RVI is forcing the 1C to go all in the shell, kills substance education in the next strat, and discourages real world abuse, encourages baiting, outweighs because the shell is fearless, they can beat it quickly. That's pretty large for paradigm issues, but here is the counter interpretation to T, or theory. It'll look basically the same. Counterinterpret. The AF may defend a singular democracy. This is the card. It's basically a semantic I meet. These are common. Semantics is just like grammatical. So A doesn't necessitate genericity. Air AF because the generic interpretation is rare and doesn't apply to the rest. And this is just like why the AF can specify. These are the standards clash. Over limiting discourages in-depth research because unifying AF ground is only surface level and one AF for 2 months produces stale debates. AF ground picks cause the same debates but in reverse, which is net worse since it's more late breaking. The 1AR time is time crunched and there's no universal advantage. This means the topical version of the affirmative doesn't solve. I think the presentation actually missed this, but topical versions of the affirmative are necessary for the topicality debate if you're proposing T, because it's essentially saying that like there's a way to actually become topical. Yeah. If you're wondering why topicality, is like only run against AF debaters, it's because the neg actually has no burden whatsoever to debate the topic. Absolutely none. They just have to respond to what the AF says and defeat it. Onto other standards. Functional limits check. AF needs solvency advocate, robust literature, and upcoming elections, or they lose to generics for the K. 5, generics check. Did they get Ks like PES or set call, democracy disads, NCs, and generic plan and counter plans like conscientious objectors. Ks, don't worry about the Ks. You don't know what those are probably. Another standard is topic education. Obviously links into education. And this is just like response to topicality arguments. Yeah, those are just like, that's T in theory, or examples of T in theory. I am going to go on now to what would be called an underview. So it's always at the bottom of the case. So here's an underview. 1 AR and 1AC theory. So J, anything else means infinite abuse, which is drop the debater. 1 AR and 1 AC. And the 1 AR and the 1 AC are too short to make up for the time trade-off. No RPIs. 6-minute 2 NR means they can brute force me every time. Competing interps. Otherwise, the 2 NR could drown the AF in arguments while playing defense. AF theory first. Much to larger strategic loss. 1/4 of the 1 AR versus 1/7 of the 1 AC. Theory debate should be evaluated after the 1 AR. The 1 AR is too short to be able to rectify abuse and adequately cover substance. You must be punished and get no 2 in our paradigm issues, theory, or RBIs because you 6 minutes to go for them, whereas I only have a 3-minute to error to respond, so I get crushed on time skew. These are seen as abusive, but I don't really get why. So yeah, I think that's probably it for my presentation. Thank you.